welcome to this episode of Fridays with Fintelekt, where I'm joined by Tim Holt and Richard Wood of Agencia. Tim Holt is the Director of Serious Crime and has over 38 years of experience in policing and investigations. And Richard Wood is Director of Justice, Policing and Security and has over 30 years of experience in strategy, policy design, and implementation of justice and security sector reform, counterterrorism, border management, and anti-corruption. Tim and Rick, welcome to Fridays with Fintelekt and delighted to have you here with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So to start with, can each of you give our listeners a quick overview of the work Agencia is doing in the AML CFT, financial crime or investigation space, and also a few words about your respective personal journeys in the world of AML CFT that has sort of culminated you being a part of Agencia?
Absolutely, Shirish. But let me first of all just say, Tim and I would like to thank you in particular for the effort, the work that you've put in, the time you've taken through Fintelekt to invite us to join you today. And in particular, thanks to the audience that I understand is listening in from across Asia. Tim and I are both very good talkers, and if you hear Tim or I talking too much, please tell us, because we'll very politely and diplomatically tell each other to stop. So to answer your question, first of all, let me start with Agencia. Agencia it's an award-winning team. We are an award-winning team. We're listed in the United Kingdom's 2020 Parliamentary Review as one of 14 best practice business services, winners of the 2019 and again 2020 Northern Powerhouse Export Champions Award by the Department of International Trade. We're winners of the National Family Business Award and are approved contractors to the United Kingdom government's conflict and stability framework. We work right across the rule of law chain, and we support health and social services. So that's just a snapshot of Agencia. I came into Agencia through the European Union's External Action Service, which is the equivalent of the Foreign Office. I was a diplomat there, and I was senior advisor and head of rule of law, working with a fantastic team of subject matter experts who dealt with a number of issues, but to this subject, particularly with the Financial Action Task Force, Moneyval, which is a group that evaluates money laundering and measures and financing of terrorism through the Council of Europe, and also Greco, which is an anti-corruption body with the Council of Europe. And specifically, we were assisting Bosnia and Herzegovina in the Balkans to develop their anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism and anti-corruption standards. I've spent 20 years working internationally across the rule of law chain to counter serious and organised crime, with an almost equal amount of time within the UK Police Service. So that's my introduction. So Tim, over to you, sir.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I just want to echo Richard's comments about thanking you, Shirish, and everybody for inviting us along. I know we've been in contact for well over 18 months, Shirish, so finally we've made it, which is great from my point of view. Brief background from myself. I joined Avon and Somerset Police back in 1980, which is an awful long time ago now. And my love affair with financial crime, I suppose you could call it that, because it's been my life really since about 1996, prompted by a couple of cases that I dealt with before then. When I joined the FIU, Financial Investigation Unit within Avon and Somerset, worked there for 8 years, then joined the Assets Recovery Agency, which was a pioneering agency in the UK, born through the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002. And I joined the Assets Recovery Agency as a trainer, just a simple trainer as it was then, but our responsibility was to train all financial investigators from all the agencies, all the law enforcement agencies that were going to use the powers that the Proceeds of Crime Act gave us. The Assets Recovery Agency morphed into several other organisations, but the basic department that I worked in is now called the Proceeds of Crime Centre and works within the National Crime Agency, as you're probably aware. and have the sole remit for training all FIs, still have the sole remit for training all FIs throughout the UK, and have done some training abroad. In 2008, I retired from the police in 2010. Initially, I was on secondment. Then I joined the NCA full time, and finally, I retired for the second time, I suppose, in 2018. By which stage I had got to know Agencia. They commissioned me to do some work in Kenya with a colleague of mine. So my first real interaction with Agencia was developing a brand new FI course, financial investigation course, a basic training course for a new set or a new team of financial investigators within Kenya. Not only did we talk about financial investigation, but we also dealt with other basic core skills such as interviewing, exhibits handling, that sort of stuff, all of which are essential as an investigator when you're going to deal with financial investigation. Since then, I've been lucky enough to be appointed as the Director of Serious Crime in Agencia, and I've been involved in projects in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which we just finished, which was with the prosecutor's office, ostensibly making them more aware so that they could become more efficient in their financial investigations. Maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, because it will come into other aspects. I've worked in Kosovo with judges and prosecutors there, and we're currently doing some work in the Caribbean, developing a more advanced FI course. We already delivered one back in summer last year for multi-agency training. It's a bit more advanced than base level, but obviously the Caribbean, British Overseas Territories have their own separate issues, which we're still very much interested in, bearing in mind it's the British Overseas Territories. I think a common theme around what is now more prevalent within financial investigation, anti-money laundering, corruption, money laundering, all the elements of it, is there is more welcoming of a multi-agency approach, and certainly we bring that into the training and the consultancy and mentoring and what have you that we're currently involved in. So yeah, it's quite a busy time at the moment, but here we are. So
excellent. I think that's actually going to get our listeners to know you much better. And a lot of our community at Fintelekt is from banks, financial institutions, reporting entities. So let me jump onto that side first. So what would you say are some of the priority areas that banks or financial institutions need to address to make their AML and CFT frameworks more effective, bearing in mind that eventually the data submitted on suspicious transaction reports should actually be quickly actionable by the FIU, and it should be practically usable by the law enforcement agencies. So how would you say banks can make the investigator's job easier?
Well, that's I suppose the multi-million-dollar question, literally. Obviously, having worked in this area since 1996, I've had quite a bit of experience of dealing with banks and dealing with intelligence and evidence from banks, both in an operational sense, in an advisory sense, and also in one or two instances in a training environment as well. The traditional communication that has always been there between law enforcement and banks are suspicious transaction reports or suspicious activity reports. Quite often that is how law enforcement first become available of suspicious transactions of a particular subject. So clearly that is an initial and a very important part of the communication process. I think from a law enforcement perspective, one of the priority areas that banks and other financial institutions who are subject to this regime, maybe they need to look at the content and the focus of suspicious transaction reports. What exactly is it that they're trying to fulfill their obligations under the various pieces of legislation that they have to make these STRs? What is it they're trying to say? because quite often what we've found over the years, and is still unfortunately the case, is that suspicious transaction reports are often used to cover activity which has been perpetrated by a bank in terms of covering up transactions that maybe they didn't give enough thought to before the transaction took place. So after the horse has bolted, if you like. That's unfortunate. And of course, there's lots of different reasons for that. It could be willful, hopefully not, but it could be. Or it could be just not appreciating all the circumstances surrounding certain transactions. I have known a lot of cases where banks have reported crimes through the STR regime, and that's not what this is about. The STR regime is about suspicious transactions. And from a financial investigator's point of view, it's frustrating when you get a large number of STRs, a lot of which are not used for the reason that the regime is there. And if you take the UK, for example, last year, 2020, there was over 500,000 STRs. Now that's spread among 43 police forces in England and Wales, and other law enforcement agencies. There is no way that a very large proportion of those are ever going to be investigated. So it needs to be pared down and the quality needs to be improved. And clearly that is something that can only be achieved through experience of both investigators from a police perspective, but also from the private industry, from the bank's perspective, to try and make these reports more focused for what they are supposed to be, reporting suspicious transactions. The other moving on from that as well, a frustration from law enforcement, please tell me to shut up in a minute, Rick, but a frustration from law enforcement is also that when you receive an STR or an SAR, as they are in the UK, and you need to go back to the institution to maybe substantiate some detail, quite often you get the response, well, I need a court order, or we can't tell you anymore, or whatever. That is a source of frustration for financial investigators. There is a mechanism by which you can exchange information and on an intelligence-only basis. And that is worth exploring. And it's quite often the fact that, and it's just, we'll talk about law enforcement in a little more detail a bit later on, but certainly there is a need there for the financial institution staff that are dealing in this area or they're working in this area to perhaps be more aware of what they can and can't disclose. And be prepared to do that. And it's about, again, about multi-agency approach. Go on, Rich.
No, I was just going to say, we'll pick up on that, Tim, and dig underneath what you're saying, because you're absolutely right. The need for focused reporting is extremely important. But I think on a wider sense and digging underneath that, there is need for a multi-agency approach, a multidisciplinary approach. But there's also a need within the banks and financial institutions to empower and to actually engage employees in the fight against these illicit transactions, and to ensure that they can actually report without any fear of retaliation. Yeah. And I think that's quite important. There's a fear that exists inside the institutions and also inside police services. There's a need to enact and enforce strong laws, but also in particular internal processes that protect whistleblowers, so ensuring that personnel, employees have access to safe and confidential reporting mechanisms, particularly important in countries where there is endemic corruption. Anti-money laundering programs need to be rigorously brought in using risk-based approaches and anti-money laundering compliance programs, which focus on risk assessment, especially during customer onboarding, applying risk-based approaches to report to the regulators. So customer due diligence and knowing your customer procedures should be applied effectively and rigorously. Also, I believe that independent auditors really do have a role. Banks and financial institutions should be using auditors to measure their anti-money laundering compliance. I think also it's useful to think about mechanisms that prevent bribery, things like company registers, inspections and oversight. Also within the bank and financial institutions, maintaining, and the same goes for policing services, prosecution services, maintaining anti-money laundering professionals who are trained to actually do the job and advise other people within the teams. Money laundering and financing terrorism often goes hand in hand with corruption, corrupt states, organizations, and people who assist. If you look at the cost of corruption, bribery, theft, tax evasion, and other illicit financial flows right across the developing world, it costs $1.26 trillion every year. That's enough money to lift 1.4 billion people who get less than the poverty threshold, above the poverty threshold for 6 years. I mean, it's a huge amount of money, and it remains a major issue and a key challenge right across Asia. 1 in 5 people who access public services paid a bribe last year. That equates to 836 million people in 17 countries across Asia. Those are frightening figures and really do show that action needs to be taken, firm and hard action. So that's about it. So just coming in underneath what you've said, Tim.
Yeah, I think, and just to sum up that, I think public-private partnerships are really important, even more so in this day and age. And I think they are. I mean, the attitudes towards releasing information from banks, from financial institutions to law enforcement is improving without a shadow of a doubt. Without any shadow of a doubt, still needs to improve a lot more from both perspectives as well. We'll come on to law enforcement in a while, but it certainly does need, and that is the way forward. And it's another theme that we'll go through is that about trust. And you mentioned about the protection of source and their sources and their perception of what happens if they give information. But there's no getting away from it. That the release and the sharing of information is paramount to being able to stop launderers, to be able to trace where they're sending their funds. Because let's face it, you can send funds around the world in the space of a couple of minutes these days, can't you, through several accounts. It makes it even more difficult for us, and I still include myself as us investigators, to try and get it back to its rightful owners, or to try and stop it, or to trace it. It's very, very difficult. But we mustn't give up the fight.
Right. Excellent. So I think those were very, very interesting perspectives. Let's speak a bit about, as you said, the policing side or the investigation system side. So, again, on that side, what would you say are some of the gaps, from an AML point of view in policing or within the investigation system? And what would you say are the expectations that the law enforcement or intelligence agencies have from the banking and financial sector with respect to financial crime mitigation?
Okay. I'm lucky enough. I've done some work in Asia not too long ago. I chaired a financial crime intelligence conference, which was held in Kuala Lumpur. Unfortunately, it was all done over Zoom, like we are now, which is a shame. But it was very interesting, and having worked around the world, again in places such as wide apart as Trinidad and Bosnia and Kosovo and France and Belgium, the issues are fairly similar right across the board, in that law enforcement do not have an appreciation of banks' obligations in terms of confidentiality to their customers, the way that they can and cannot report transactions, whether they consider them to be suspicious or not, and really what their positions are in the exchange of intelligence. I think that's a huge gap. And having been involved in training for the best part of 16 years now, through my roles with the NCA and now with Agencia, There is definitely a shortfall or a shortcoming within law enforcement in general as to what and how they would go about getting intelligence information from the financial sector. There is also a problem with management. Not every single manager, but a general misconception that financial crime is not that important. It's not high up the scale. Now, Rick's just given you some figures which are truly breathtaking. Money laundering and corruption has victims, make no bones about it. 1 in 5 people have to pay a bribe to get a certain service done. That is corruption at its highest level. And it's similar in the UK, it's similar across the world. And money laundering is the single biggest perpetrator of that, because if you didn't have the money launderer, the person that deals with the money to make it seem legitimate, you wouldn't have the crime in the first place. Crime would be severely reduced. And it does affect everybody. I mean, financial crime, fraud, which has obviously gone through the roof since the pandemic started, it affects the cost of insurance. So it does affect us. It affects our tax. It affects our banking procedures and the way that the banks deal with us. It affects our costs for our own technology, like our mobile phones and things like that. It affects the way that we look at it. It affects our IT security. And also in the extreme cases, when you're talking about drug traffickers, you're talking about people traffickers, there are some very obvious victims in it. And yet the perpetrators are the heads of the organized crime groups are the ones that are getting the money and then laundering it through our financial institutions. Therefore, the investigator needs to know exactly how he or she can go about getting that information lawfully and legitimately from the banks. And that is sometimes, not every single time, and it's not meant as a criticism, it's meant as an area where we could all improve. An investigator needs to know what a bank can and can't do. That's the bottom line. What intelligence can I get and how can I get it? And how do I then turn it into evidence when I actually find the perpetrator? And it must be done through court orders, as we know, and that's the same across the world. It's not just in the UK, it's not just in India, it's everywhere. You need to be able to turn it into evidence through going through the proper orders through the court, but you can get access to the intelligence. So there is a lot of areas there. I think there are other areas as well. One of the other things that Rick mentioned is this protection of sources. With regards to financial investigators, law enforcement officers, they are taught the value of intelligence and the value of the intelligence sources. So people that make suspicious activity reports from a very small branch of a bank out in deepest, darkest Wales, where they are on their own and potentially vulnerable, law enforcement officers must recognise the value of protecting that source at all costs. Hence the caveats around disclosing of suspicious transaction reports and their origin. And I don't think that is actually championed enough within the training that we do. Certainly from my perspective, having worked in many parts of the world. Police officers, unfortunately, and I was one, and I know that in the early days, I thought the same. Police officers think that because a certain organisation holds some information, then they're duty bound to give it to the police. Well, only if the right orders, only if the right circumstances are there. And there are reasons for that. And we must understand that in terms of law enforcement. There are ways of getting it, quite correct ways. It's just that we need to go through those systems in order to get it.
So there's a need for, there's two sides in the equation, the banks, the financial institutions, and the police, to actually come together and share what each other does to develop a much better understanding of how the system.
Public-private partnerships, about trust. It's about working together. Exactly.
I think you're going to talk about later. Yeah. So just again, to come in from a slightly different angle and perhaps to look at it from a higher level, within Agencia and certainly within the work that I've been doing over the last 20 years working internationally, working right across the rule of law chain with judiciary, prosecutors, the police, the probation, prison services, in particular, the judiciary, the prosecution and police need to be independent of politics. So this is a major issue right across the developing world. There needs to be completely independent and transparent processes in everything from recruitment, selection, appointment, promotion, training, discipline, performance management processes that can withstand all attempts by politicians to interfere with the rule of law chain. And I think that's of paramount importance. There are many examples of the judiciary, of prosecutors and police being appointed politically or buying their way into choice posts. And the rule of law chain needs to be setting a rigorous example that this can only become, that they can only get there by ensuring complete independence with oversight and transparency of process. And banks need to assist with the anti-money laundering programs. So again, coming back to what Tim was saying, communication and coordination are key, sharing risks, developing rigorous customer due diligence as outlined previously. But I think one of the biggest challenges is the independence of the judiciary, the independence of the prosecutors, and the independence of the police service. I'm very happy to say that I've spent most of my career working in those areas.
Excellent, excellent, fascinating. So, you know, these days we can't have any conversation without mentioning the pandemic, right? And you know, the pandemic is causing changes in the business models of terrorist organizations as well, and organized crime groups. There's increased criminal activity around digital and cyber. So what is your recommendation to regulators and also to the banking sector to better understand, identify, mitigate these risks practically and effectively? And also, I mean, you mentioned public-private partnerships. So, is this an area where you know, financial information sharing or PPPs can make a difference? What do you?
Yeah. What do we think? Well, again, let me just give you an overview, and I know Tim he's already mentioned PPPs and will no doubt expand upon that. But yeah, here we are living in a world with booming economies, very fast modernization, and a continued growth of what we refer to as the middle class. And these are some of the key trends that are shaping Asia. The disruptive effect of COVID-19, the pandemic, and its economic consequences really cannot be overstated. So you're right to bring that to the fore in this question. Many countries across the region are managing well, while there are others that are still suffering huge health and economic crises. Throughout that, though, there is absolutely no doubt, in particular our own, and almost on a weekly basis, I'm getting phishing emails and attempts to extort money through different means. So all countries have been affected by the pandemic by a huge increase in cybercrime and criminal activity through cyberspace. This is awful because it's affecting health services, it's affecting our ability to respond to the COVID pandemic. And the reality is, if we get to the bottom line, this is causing people to die. So that's how serious it is. Information sharing plays a vital role, and I've already mentioned it, but it allows financial institutions and supervisory and law enforcement authorities to better deploy resources on a risk-based approach. And I come back to that risk-based approach that must be taken by all financial institutions to develop innovative techniques to combat money laundering and terrorist financing, and also to combat the corruption that goes alongside it. So with those risk-based approaches, if you can build a picture of potential threats, you can also build the mechanisms to counter those threats. So Tim, I've no doubt at all you're going to tell us a bit more about PPPs and how effective they can be.
Well, as I said at the start, in my opinion, and obviously this is just just my opinion and what I've picked up as I've worked in this area, and I've been lucky enough to work over a wide area of countries with a wide background of agencies and organisations. PPPs are essential in this day and age, without any shadow of a doubt, because there is so much information held, not only by law enforcement, but within the private sector as well. That information, a lot of that information is vital in tracing laundered funds, is vital in tracing identities of perpetrators, identities of organised crime groups, and terrorist groups. And make no bones about it, terrorist organisations rely on the financial sector and the financial systems as much as anybody else. Maybe the money is used slightly differently. Laundering is not so blatant and in not such great numbers necessarily, but is there for a specific reason, to allow working capital for our terrorist groups. So there's lots of areas. Now, in the UK, and I can speak with a good deal of authority from my previous work in the UK, we have an organisation called CIFAS, which is, I don't know whether you've heard of it, Shirish, but it's an organisation based in London which has a number of members who are private financial institutions, and also police forces. And what they would do, and it's been going for many, many years, what they would do is collate criminal trends such as frauds who have transcended a number of different financial institutions. They would then send out alerts to police and what have you. So it was a form of public-private partnership. But in 2015, as our technology was rapidly evolving, the bright idea was born of the JMLAT, the Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force. Now, I believe that you've had some input on this in previous sessions that you've run before. But to me, this is a groundbreaking and really successful example of where public-private partnerships work. Traditionally, banks, we had a thing called the Mutual Dialogue department before, which was run in conjunction with the National Crime Agency, where banks would share some information with the National Crime Agency, but it was all done very haphazardly. There was no regular way of enforcing it or taking information away from it. So the JMLAT was formed, and it's an official body now. It's chaired by the National Crime Agency. They meet on a monthly basis, and they share all sorts of information. Obviously, it's sensitive. Obviously, it's confidential. But there is a lot of intelligence which is very valuable in the way of tracing and investigating senior or prolific financial criminals, and not only financial criminals, other criminals as well, who use the financial institutions as a background to their work, to their criminality. And it brings together now over 40 financial institutions together with law enforcement, which is absolutely amazing, because obviously with all the confidentiality clauses that banks and financial institutions have to have around their businesses, this is a real first. Now, I know that in some other countries, I've been trained in Europe and out in Africa, I know that a lot of other countries are looking at this and looking at ways that they can form similar models, and I would encourage that to the nth degree, because it is certainly a groundbreaking way of sharing intelligence and information and working together, and actually working together for a common purpose, which is recovering the proceeds of crime and locking up the individuals involved, which is what it's about. It's about trust, mutual communication, and teamwork. Public-private partnerships, they are definitely the way forward in this IT age that we find ourselves now, even more so with the pandemic. You know, a lot of things have gone remotely. IT has again improved over the course of the pandemic. We're all talking on Zoom and things like that. In the early days, Zoom was even questioned, wasn't it? Where people could jump in on confidential Zoom conferences and what have you. So it transcends everything. So it's really, really important that the relevant organisations, both law enforcement from the public sector and the private sector, work together for a common goal.
Excellent. So, you spoke about, recovering the proceeds of crime, and in many countries, the efforts on asset recovery or confiscation are actually compromised due to weak laws, corruption, low governance standards. Now, I think we all agree that this is a problem, but are there any particular jurisdictions that you think need to significantly ramp up? And, in the same breath, are there any success stories that you would like to share?
Yeah, I mean, this is a real issue, Shirish. It's an area that remains for significant improvement right across the world. Inadequate legislation is causing a major problem. There's lots of examples, negative examples, unfortunately. I can think of an aircraft that's been parked in a country for over 10 years now, whilst wrangling goes on about how to get rid of the aircraft through asset seizure legislation. It's costing another country that seized the aircraft thousands and thousands of dollars every year to keep that aircraft there, and all of the time that aircraft is corroding. So by the time they get to sell it, it'll be worth nothing. The same thing, I can think of a large boat that was seized, exactly the same story. It's being held and it is now completely worthless because it's been held for so long. So that many bad examples. And that's caused by lots of different reasons, but the main issue is inadequate legislation, and also lack of training to judges, to prosecutors about how to actually get an asset that's been seized through the court system and out the other side. Success stories, I mean, there's one in the UK and it links to unexplained wealth orders, which is a nice one to mention. It refers, just last year, a Leeds businessman who had links to serious organised crime. He lost a vast property worth £10 million after a National Crime Agency investigation. And he agreed at the end to hand over 45 properties in London, Cheshire and Leeds, and 4 parcels of land. The settlement was just agreed in October. Tim, I'm sure you'll have some examples to talk about.
Well, this is a huge area, as you've already identified, Shirish and Richard. Having worked in many different places, it's quite clear that asset recovery, confiscation, forfeiture legislation is very inconsistent across the world. Even in some places where they've got asset recovery offices, asset recovery management offices, it's not clear how they actually operate, even if they do operate. Unfortunately, corruption is a major issue. There's no getting around that. It is a major issue. I can think of certain, I'm not going to name and shame because this is not the environment for that. But there is certainly areas within Europe and across the world where the will to fully carry out asset recovery in its entirety is perhaps not quite there, albeit there are the appropriate noises being made in the respective governments. Well, we put this legislation in place, that legislation in place. It's all very well to do that, but you still need the willingness to enforce that legislation. And unfortunately, in a lot of places, that is not the case, and corruption no doubt plays a major issue. Another theory I have, and it is a theory, is that obviously different countries, different jurisdictions have a different system of prosecutions, different prosecutorial system. Ours is led by the investigators, by the police, who then work with the Crown Prosecution Service, and Bosnia, for example, is led by the prosecutors. And there is definitely a gap in some jurisdictions where the prosecutors, who have to deal with a very, very wide range of issues, crimes, whatever it might be, that their knowledge of what can be achieved through financial investigation, through anti-money laundering inquiries, is perhaps not what it should be. So there is that inconsistency. It can be done. I mean, it can be improved. It's just, is there the will and the willingness to actually do that? I think an improvement would be an increase in the conception of non-conviction based confiscation and forfeiture. I'm talking about civil recovery, basically. A lot of jurisdictions have this in place now. We've got it in the UK, as you know, and it's becoming more and more the fashionable thing to do, and more where we can recover the proceeds of crime, where we haven't necessarily got a strong enough case to convict somebody for particular crimes. Clearly, it's quite complex. We're not going to go into that now, but there is the concept of that which would be available, and is available in a lot of jurisdictions if they looked through their legislation and had a willingness to make it work. So I think that is one thing that could be looked at. Success stories is difficult because even the UK is pretty far-reaching and has been since the Proceeds of Crime Act came in. We certainly haven't got everything right. We know that. We've done all right in the latest FATF examination, which they did a couple of years ago, but we certainly haven't got it all right. Having said that, the success story that we have got is we're starting to be able to deal with assets in a much more effective way. And I'm talking about online auctions, in-person auctions, things like that, where you have this property which has been recovered, whether it was seized as a part of a crime or whether it was seized and then given up by a perpetrator as a result of confiscation. Online and in-person auctions tend to realise good amounts for that property which has been taken away from the defendants, and certainly in the UK that's quite the norm now, that specific auction companies deal with the proceeds of crime, and more foreign countries are taking it on board. Malta, Australia, New Zealand, places like that, they're seeing the value of that they can actually properly, officially and efficiently deal with assets that have been recovered from criminals. So that is something which is something to be, championed, something to be shared. And, long may it continue. We need to open our imagination to the ways in which we can deal with this. And that's right across the board, right across the world. But it can be done. We mustn't lose sight of the fact that we need to recover the proceeds of crime, because why should criminals have our money, which is effectively what they are doing? Why should they have them? We need to recover them for the benefit of ourselves and for our communities.
Right. So, Tim and Rick, before I let you go, one more question for you. I mean, you both have significant experience in training, advisory, capacity building. So what would you say is lacking in terms of training or awareness on AML, CFT across, the entire ecosystem, different types of stakeholders? And which areas of training do you think are the most underdeployed, or let's say underestimated, in terms of topics that is hindering the effectiveness and efficiencies of banks, regulators, and investigating agencies?
Obviously, I've got a lot of experience in training, advisory, mentoring, and capacity building over the years. If I can talk a little bit, and my apologies for this, but obviously my major experiences within the UK, having worked very, very closely within building up the Proceeds of Crime Centre and the way that it operates now. They still do a fantastic job there. They have a responsibility for training all FIs from law enforcement agencies. One area that's lacking is definitely, I've touched on it before, is a consistency of training, input, and working together with the private industry, i.e. banks and other financial institutions. To my mind, and I know that the view is shared by a lot of other people who worked within my role, the value of the training program that we have in the UK would be greatly enhanced if people that worked in the private sector within the AML functions would benefit greatly from it, and so would the investigators, because there would be a mutual swapping of information on what our priorities are. So what are the bank's obligations? They have an obligation of confidentiality, of course they do. So how does it work then? How can they release intelligence? How can we give evidence to our colleagues in law enforcement who we want to help? And how can law enforcement go about it? You don't pick up the phone and say, I'm investigating Joe Bloggs, give me all the information. It doesn't work like that. So a cross-section of people from private industry, people from the banking industry with law enforcement within the training would be a step forward, in my opinion. The other alternative would be, of course, to introduce, because in the UK, and I know across many countries now, there is structured training for investigators working in financial crime. In the UK, we have different levels. We have the financial intelligence officer level, which all investigators go through, then the financial investigator level up to confiscation. And they are all separate training courses, examinations, and they're accredited training as well. You cannot operate in the field of financial investigation without undergoing that training and getting the accreditation. And they must maintain that through continual professional development. To my mind, the introduction of a similar type of training strategy within private industry would also benefit everybody. So I think there's gaps on both sides. Now, I don't know what the training strategy is within, for example, HSBC as opposed to Santander, as opposed to Credit Suisse, or whatever it might be. But why can't we, or why can't they, get together and organise a joint training regime where people are trained to a similar standard? So the standards are the same across all the banks. Does that make sense? Do you know what I'm trying to get across? Absolutely. So that somebody that works in HSBC knows what a law enforcement officer working in London or in Birmingham or in Mumbai actually wants when they're dealing with an investigation, and the response provided the request is done properly, the response is going to be the same whether it's HSBC, Santander, Lloyds, or the Raiffeisen Bank in Kosovo, for example. So that there is a standard format and a mutual understanding of what the desires are. And I think that's a massive gap. And we've been talking about public-private partnerships, working together, mutual communication, mutual trust. That would go a long way to bridging that gap. And I genuinely think that's the biggest area where we as law enforcement, and I'm in private industry now myself, but we as law enforcement could learn a lesson, could learn a lot, but also so could the banks. And we've talked about working together. We need to do this. We need to do this to be able to be more efficient in tracing money and tracing funds, and locking at the bad guys. And that's what it's about: recovering the proceeds and locking at the bad guys. I've got lots of other thoughts on it, Shirish. It would take me forever, but it's
Right. Thanks
for another
Tim.
day. So just to come in on the back of what Tim's saying, I think that there's a need to look at consequences, because I don't think enough people understand the consequences of these illicit activities. I think that it prevents legitimate businesses from flourishing, but most of all, it prevents those most in need from accessing the public services, in particular at the moment, health services. And as I suggested right at the beginning, Agencia can offer bespoke training systems and process development for anti-money laundering officers, for FIs, for banks, for financial institutions, for judges and prosecutors and police. And Tim and I would be really happy to hear from you or any of the people listening in, and we can discuss how we can assist to transform your organizations to beat these illicit financial transactions and corruption. So once again, Shirish, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to talk with you alongside your fireplace and people listening in Asia. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rick, and thanks to you as well, Tim, for being here today and sharing those.
Pleasure.
I think they were very, very interesting.
Absolute pleasure.